Alex Newman, the era of big control of education is not over. It did not end with Donald Trump, and Betsy DeVos is not the leader who's going to end this. We got a great story from you this week about how Utah, the state of Utah, has been pushed around by Betsy DeVos, strong-armed, into altering their curriculum, their state educational plan to meet her federal guidelines. Talk a little bit about this story.
What's happening in Utah, and I imagine this is happening in other states too, it just hasn't come out yet, is that the Secretary of Education and one of her minions, Botel, I think he's an assistant deputy secretary of some sort, and they're bullying the state of Utah into forcing children to take tests, because in Utah, the authorities there decided that parents and children have a right to opt out of these federally backed Common Core aligned government tests that really measure all sorts of things, collect all sorts of data for Big Brother. People are rightly outraged about this, and so people aren't taking the tests. Last year, I think 6% of students opted out of the tests, presumably with permission from their parents. But what Betsy DeVos and her regime there at the Department of Education said is that that's not acceptable. You need to have at least 95% of the students taking the tests, or you're going to be penalized. So again, you have the federal government here behaving as if it is in charge of education when the Constitution clearly provides no authority over education to the federal government.
Well, the Constitution does not, but as we've talked about before, the ESSA Act, the Every Student Succeeds Act, that's kind of like the Affordable Care Act in terms of labeling something exactly what it's not. The ESSA is not about student success. It's about stuff like this. 2015, December, the Republican-controlled Congress and Senate rammed through in 2 days a ESSA bill, which basically gave the federal government, for the first time in American history, this kind of centralized control. We can talk about how unconstitutional this is, but we have Republicans to thank for passing a bill, the ESSA Act, which allows Betsy DeVos to tell states what to do now. If you don't do something, state of Utah, if any state in the union, prevents a educational plan for the state that benefits their state, that their state families sign on to, the feds can just change it or withhold money, right? That's pretty much where we are.
That's exactly right. And you're right. For the first time in history now, the Secretary of Education has the authority to approve or deny states' education plans, which, first of all, requires a state education plan. Back in the day, the idea of a state education plan would have been inconceivable, right? I mean, maybe a town government could set up a local school, but you certainly wouldn't have a state education plan. Well, now you do, and it has to be approved by the Secretary of Education under this monstrosity called the ESSA. You're right. We have the Republicans to thank. They just blatantly lied to us. They said this is going to get the federal government out of education. It's going to return historic amounts of control over education to the state and local government, when it did the exact opposite. It centralized more and more control in Washington, D.C. It's an absolute disgrace. It cemented Common Core in place, and it's just a disaster on top of a disaster, and it's not going to get any better until the American people get outraged enough to demand that it end.
Well, you have a Republican control of Congress and the Senate. You have a Republican president. You have a Republican appointee at the Department of Education. And still, this is what you get. Can you imagine what's going to happen the next time you have a progressive Democrat president? You think any opting out of tests is going to be allowed? What's to stop the next Secretary of Education under a Democrat from saying, if you have even one student opt out of one exam, we will withhold your state education budget unless you implement our federal curriculum in terms of sexuality. Unless you import radical sexuality into your kindergartens, you get no money for your state. That's coming down the road, and there doesn't seem anybody interested in stopping this.
That's exactly right. And what I wrote in my takeaway is that it's time for the state governments to say, enough of this stuff. We're not going to do it anymore. In most cases, the federal funding of education at the state and local level amounts to less than 10% of the budget. Down in Florida, a guy that I know who was running for governor crunched the numbers and found out that it would be very, very easy. And in fact, it would be cost effective for the state to cut all ties with the federal government and start doing its own thing. I'm sure that's true in Utah, and it's probably true in virtually every other state. The cost of implementing these mandates and hiring all the bureaucrats and compliance officers and administrators to comply with this abomination coming out of Washington, D.C. is more than they're getting from the feds. Why would you do it? It's ridiculous. And it makes education worse. So I think states need to start reclaiming their sovereignty and say, you know what? Go pound sand, take your little federal funding and shove it. We don't want it anymore. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Almost every state in the union Union, I should say, gets less than 10% of its education budget from the feds. That's really a rounding error in accounting terms for how much money the states are already spending. Every state in the union could just tell the federal government, we will give you back that 6%, 8%. We'll find a way within the state to raise it, and we will take control of our kids' education again. Just earlier in the week, we had a story about Betsy DeVos. She said, and good for her, she said she will not weigh in on the question of whether local schools can arm their teachers. Now, that's a good answer. Right, I admire that. Betsy DeVos didn't say, we are going to use the full force of the federal government to stop local school districts from arming their teachers with guns and training them. However, why is it any of Betsy DeVos's damn business? What gives her the right? And I'm glad she said no. But again, the next Department of Education secretary under a Democrat is going to use the power that Betsy DeVos is not getting rid of. She's protecting. So what you're doing here is you may have the next 2 to 6 years you may have relative stability and not a whole lot of overreach from the federal government. But you do have a situation where the Republicans aren't going to pull these destructive laws out, and you watch what happens with the next one.
That's right. And, now we have a historic opportunity with this president and a Republican-controlled Congress to undo this giant mess. We have most of the states controlled by Republicans solidly, right? The legislature and the governor. It's time to take some serious action to cut this out. It's been an absolute disaster. The kids are getting dumber and dumber. It's costing more and more money to make them dumber and dumber. It's time for some of the states to take the lead and let the other states follow and say, enough of this. We're not going to keep dumbing down the kids in exchange for some pennies with strings attached.
Well, sad to say that even Michael Phelps himself could not hold his breath long enough for those changes to take place. I think the writing's on the wall. Alex, thanks again for a fantastic report, and we'll talk to you soon.